Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce, as Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Where should we go to first? Well, I've just finished my Frontline update, and as soon as I finish that, something comes out updating the Frontline, and I'm like, ah. So what has happened? Well, I don't really know, other than in the area of Vuhledar, which I said in my update was fairly positional now. Well, there are claims that in that area, Ukrainian troops have advanced up to a kilometer. I don't know exactly where. I know that around that area there was pressure to the south. What do we have? Southwest of Pavlivka, as well as pushing the Russians back to the river just north of Pavlivka. So it might be in one of those areas. It could be anywhere though. So that is just to give you a bit of an update. There appears to be some activity in and around Vuhledar, not in Vuhledar, around Vuhledar to the south. Anyway, I want to go on to talk to you about HIMARS and M270. Someone pointed out that M270s are HIMARS, but not HIMARS. And so when I am victim of using HIMARS to talk about GIMLRS, guided multiple launch rocket systems. But actually, it's not quite correct. I really should use GIMLRS to refer to both HIMARS and M270. I'll probably continue using HIMARS because it's in the common parlance now. It's really difficult not to. Anyway, I'm going to go to one of Oryx's lists. Check out Oryx's. Oryx has a list of lists, right? Where and their list of lists for 2022, 74 lists in 2022, and then further lists in 2023. Just well worth checking out the list. This guy loves a list. Anyway, I am going to go back to look at answering the call, heavy weaponry supply to Ukraine. This is a fascinating list that gives you an up-to-date version of what has been given. Well, I say up to date, actually last updated in April. Well, no, that's complete rubbish. It was is consistently updated. It was created in April, of course, last year. Anyway, just to go down the list, so you've got aircraft, you've got helicopters, drones, tanks. So how many tanks? 790 plus. Of which 575 have been delivered, 212 are pledged. Armored fighting vehicles, 40 plus, of which 40 have been delivered. Infantry fighting vehicles, 790, of which 500 have been delivered. APCs, 1,740, of which 1,180 have been delivered. And this is where you can get into looking at the 196 YPR 765. So those are the M113 variants that the Dutch have produced. 196 of them. I mean, goodness me, that's a lot. So yeah, as you can see, Americans 300 M113s. That's why we see a lot of them out there. My MRAPs, mine-resistant ambush protection vehicles, 1,100 plus. Quite a lot of vehicles there. And then we come down to towed artillery, 425, self-propelled artillery, 460. Interesting, there's more self-propelled artillery being given than towed artillery, and that could be because you're seeing a phase out of the towed artillery. And this is kind of what I was actually originally going to talk to you about, HIMARS replacing artillery. I just wanted to find a good article to discuss that, but I couldn't quite find one. I know that they're still looking, and Perrin's just done a video on the future of long-ranged artillery, long-range missiles, and long-range strikes. So, I mean, they are America, the US are still looking at longer-range tubed artillery. They're looking at, say, I know last year they were still looking at one that's kind of equivalent to the Caesar or the Panzerhaubitze 2000, a kind of or wheeled base actually, so more like the Caesar. They might be looking at something like that. But I think in general, there's this move towards HIMARS instead of having towed artillery or artillery just in general, tubed artillery, sorry. And that's because HIMARS are precision. I mean, 1 meter precision, you just need coordinates, whack in the coordinates, job done. So an artillery piece might take 20 rounds to get something closer and closer, which is why they use Excalibur, precision guided munitions as artillery shells. They are more expensive. I mean, the thing is, if you want to hit things precisely and with a lot of power, it's money. It's a transaction, isn't it? It's like, well, you're paying for precision and you're paying for extra uh, explosions, right? Extra power in the explosions, and so HIMARS, you're going to be paying more, but you are going to be guaranteeing your strike more accurately, and you're going to have more explosive power than a simple artillery shell. So I think you're going to see a phasing out of artillery and a phasing in of stuff like this, and then an improvement on these pieces of kit. Uh, HIMARS are just one type of GIMLRS, guided multiple launch rocket system, and we'll talk about that. When it comes to the self-propelled artillery 460, I told you, so multiple rocket launchers, or MLRS, multiple launch rocket systems. Here we have a bunch of different ones, and these aren't guided. I think the Turkish one is. So I don't know how many of those have been given. Is a bit more secretive, that. So it might be one, might be two, might be more. So that's going to be like your, I think, like your HIMARS or M270. Then we have these ones which are like the grads. Those fire off your rockets rather than missiles. They're not guided. And then we have 38 HIMARS delivered from June of 2022 onwards. I don't know how many are out there at present. I mean, last count was 18, but actually I think it's probably more than that now. 14 M270B1 multiple launch rocket systems from the UK. Some of them were backfilled by Norway. So Norway delivered 11 M270S to the UK. That's an older variant. And then we delivered more modern M270B1S to Ukraine. Germany have provided 5 M270 Mars, a multiple launch rocket system, and then there's a couple from Italy, M270A1, multiple launch rocket system. I don't know about the French ones. The two of these LRU, I don't know if they are compatible or comparable. I'd have to look into that. Anyway, the idea is that there's a bunch of both of these, kind of the M270 and the HIMARS. What's the difference? Well, essentially, not really a lot, as in they fire the same rockets. So the M270 can fire twice as many rockets as the HIMARS. HIMARS has a pod of 6, the M270 has a pod of 12. But because you have a pod of 12, so on the one hand, the advantage is you can fire twice as many. Awesome. On the other hand, you're heavier and less mobile. So that has to be put on a tracked chassis, which is, I think, a Bradley chassis. That is used. So if we have a look at this, Ukraine has received several types of multiple rocket launchers from its Western allies, but the M270 MLRS and M142 HIMARS definitely stand out in the media due to their achievements. These systems are actually closely related. The M270 now is actually sort of like a double HIMARS, but is one M270 really as good as two HIMARS? M270 MLRS and M142 HIMARS are actually pretty much the same weapon systems. Both use the same rockets and launchers. The difference is the HIMARS is significantly lighter and more mobile, hence its full name, High Mobility Artillery Rocket System. This is because HIMARS has 6 rocket launchers, while M270 has 12, sort of like two HIMARS modules. HIMARS is also not as well armoured. Due to the increase in ammunition load, M270 has a fully tracked chassis from the Bradley fighting vehicle. It weighs around 25 tons. Meanwhile, a significantly lighter HIMARS pushes the needle on the scale to just over 16 tons. This is a huge difference. Plus, add the wheeled chassis, and you will understand why HIMARS has high mobility in its name. So this can travel along roads much more quickly. You're going to use tracks on roads. You're going to knacker the tracks, I think, more quickly, and obviously not too good for the roads, I imagine, either. So I guess the advantage to HIMARS is that you can drive it on roads all up and down Ukraine, for example, stop at the edge of the road and fire off those 6 rockets or 6 missiles from the pod, whereas that's not so easy with the less mobile tracked system. Although you've got 12 rockets to use, 12 missiles to use, you have there are advantages and disadvantages there. So I think definitely having a wheeled variant is super useful for how it's being used in Ukraine. The maximum speed of the M270 is 64 kilometers per hour, which is not that bad for basically a tank with MLRS on the top. Meanwhile, HIMARS can go to 85 kilometers per hour, which is near highway speeds. And it's not just that. HIMARS can safely go on asphalted roads without making a huge mess. Just what I was saying. M270 would destroy asphalt to bits, but it is significantly better off-road. All in all, M270 can deliver a stronger strike, more rockets, while HIMARS is more mobile. It can hit and run, shoot and scoot with much more efficiently. This doesn't mean that one is better than the other. M270 is actually a much older system, designed in 1977 and put into service in 1983. HIMARS was developed later and started its service just 12 years ago in 2010. They are both still used. M270 has better off-road stability, twice as many launchers, and better armor for the crew. It can be used when mobility is not key to the operation, although they don't stay in the same spot for very long anyway. Meanwhile, HIMARS shoots its load and disappears. Its main advantages are related to mobility, just like many disreputable men, I guess. Ukraine received its M270 systems from the UK and Germany, and the US is the main supplier of HIMARS to Ukraine. Both these systems quickly became well known to the Russian forces, as they have already destroyed multiple bases, warehouses, stockpiles deep behind the front lines. Obviously, this was written some time ago, but that is still going on to a very large scale, particularly with the current counteroffensive in Zaporizhia, where HIMARS, I think, are being used very much more to hit localized targets like artillery pieces, much smaller individual pieces. So you can see it being used as the replacement to tubed artillery. Okay, let's go to Mick Ryan, General Mick Ryan, Australian retired. My latest article is now available in the Sydney Morning Herald. In this article, I included some advice for those observing the Ukrainian 2023 counteroffensives from afar. First, understand that in military operations, first reports are almost always wrong. There have been many initial reports about successes or failure in this offensive. We should remain wary of these in the short term and not rush to judgment about the overall success or otherwise of the Ukrainian offensives. Second, it is impossible to assess the progress of a war or even a single battle from a picture or video. One photo over the weekend, so this is in response to the famous Orkhiv bit of a mess there, showing multiple Ukrainian armored vehicles damaged and stationary, was used as evidence for a multitude of different assessments. When observing the war at a distance, time is required to assemble many different data sets from varying sources to ascertain the direction of the conflict. Third, avoid the fallacy of certainty. Despite the enhanced transparency of the modern battlefield provided by a meshed network of military and civilian sensors, human will cannot be viewed remotely or through social media. The fog and friction of war, explored by Karl von Clausewitz in On War, is every bit as relevant today as it was 2 centuries ago when Clausewitz wrote the book. There are no certainties in war. Beware of those who predict definitive outcomes. Finally, strategic patience is essential. These kinds of operations are often unfold slowly at first, and then, as they generate tempo, can evolve very rapidly. We must be patient over the coming weeks. In saving their nation, the Ukrainians are attempting the most difficult form of military operation possible. They are not working to the comfortable timelines of the Western media or commentators. That's really important. And I mentioned this yesterday. They don't have air advantage, let alone air superiority, let alone air supremacy. So without that, they are really restricted in how well they can succeed. Certainly, how quickly they can succeed. They are under a lot more constraints. And although they have decent equipment in the main and fairly well trained troops, comparatively speaking, it will be a really hard challenge for them to overcome, taking those defenses. Just before I go on to some Chris O wiki threads, I want to bring this to your attention. This is someone that's just contacted me on Twitter, say, thanks for what you do. I follow what you do, yada, yada, yada. Can you share this with your viewers? I was hoping that you might retweet this information or even link to it in the description of one of your videos about a study I am conducting for my psychology master's dissertation at Brunel University on the topic of misinformation and epistemic belief. So, epistemology is a study of knowledge and truth in philosophy. So, this is a really important area of study, especially with regard to war, fifth generation warfare. It says you can email me with any questions, but if we go to what he wants you to see, I think this would be really interesting to get involved in if you've got the time and you and the wherewithal. Please check it out. So I'll leave this tweet, the link to this tweet below in the description. But he's basically, we're looking for volunteers to take part in a research study about how people decide what news stories to share on social media. The research forms part of an MSc Psychological Sciences degree at Brunel University London and involves watching a short video on YouTube and answering some multiple choice questions about social media. You will also be asked to complete a short questionnaire about what truth means to you. Your participation in this research is entirely voluntary, anonymous, and confidential. You can withdraw at any point before you submit your data without having to give a reason. So this is super, super important, as in the subject of misinformation and information when we are engaged in an information war where all of us are engaged in that war online. Russia are waging that war against us. We may not see tanks outside our houses, but we will be coming across the efforts of the Russian war machine in the virtual information space. It's when you go and do any research on this, I mean, stuff jumps out at you. So here, study, I think it's a 2018 study, provides a variety of ways of quantifying the phenomenon that false news travels quicker than truth. So, for instance, false news stories are 70% more likely to be retweeted than true stories are. That's hugely damaging to our information space and how we interact with knowledge and truth and how we interact with fake news. False news is 70% more likely to be retweeted, and it takes true stories about 6 times as long to reach 1,500 people as it does for false stories to reach the same number of people. In other words, false stories move 6 times quicker than true stories, and that's a real problem. It means truth is up against it when it comes to falsity. I am writing a book. In fact, can I get it up here for you to see? Now, oddly enough, this book is a third in my trilogy of books on biblical exegesis, right? The analysis of the Bible. Like, I'm looking critically at whether these things happen in the Bible. This is the third book in the trilogy, as I say, and is concentrating on the Exodus account and seeing whether it was historically, whether any of it happened, whether some of these people like Moses are real humans, real historical people or not, so on and so forth. And actually, I talk about things like Facebook and how false information spreads much more quickly and how it's very difficult. And imagine a time when you can't even verify things, so on and so forth. And also how we get used to really bad things happening and get desensitized to them, and it's all kind of linked together. So I did my bit yesterday on the morality of the Russian volunteer corps, right? And I mentioned Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and someone in the threads were like, "Yeah, but the those Japanese civilians weren't innocent." It's like you can't just say 100,000 Japanese people weren't innocent and therefore it was okay to send an atom bomb down and blow them up. And this is where it gets really morally problematic. But this is an example of where we have got used to some terrible bit of news that it has lost its terror, or we learnt it when we were at such a young age that we couldn't really understand the magnitude of the horror. Right? Imagine dropping an atom bomb now on Moscow, on any city in the world, on Kiev, right? No matter whose side you're on, you drop an atom bomb on a city full of civilians, you're like, that would be absolutely despicable. And yet, it's happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We're kind of like, yeah, it was done and it stopped the war and it stopped more people dying in the long run. And it's kind of like become desensitized to it. This is an example, I think, of the mere exposure effect, and this also comes down to that fake news and disinformation I was talking about. So the mere exposure effect. Let me just read for you from what I've written. This is unedited, so if I've got mistakes here, I haven't looked at it. I haven't looked at this for a year. I'm kind of co-writing it with someone else, but I've just taken a bit of a pause on it. So the mere exposure effect. Advertising is undoubtedly a powerful tool. The more you see something, the more it takes place in front and center of your mind. And the more you see something, the more acceptable it becomes. There is an element of normalization in familiarization. The mere exposure effect is the effect that merely hearing a name or idea or seeing a face, for example, we will predispose you to favor that idea or person. In other words, the maxim, any publicity is good publicity, is quite right. If you were to see a picture, even subconsciously, of someone before viewing a number of pictures of people's faces and were asked to rate each face for attractiveness, you would more likely rate a face you had already seen a higher level of attractiveness than a face you hadn't already seen, all other things remaining equal. It's a long sentence. The APA Dictionary of Psychology defines this phenomenon as follows, so the mere exposure effect. The finding of that individuals show an increased preference or liking for a stimulus as a consequence of repeated exposure to that stimulus. This effect is most likely to occur when there is no pre-existing negative attitude towards the stimulus effect, and it tends to be the strongest when the person is not consciously aware of the stimulus presentations. Right, now imagine that you've got fake news being thrown about, right? And it gets shared quicker than truth. It then becomes the case that, and it is joining the dots up, it then becomes the case that the mere exposure effect takes place. So the fake news spreads more quickly and becomes more familiar and normalized, that it becomes more credible. So that it's this virtuous circle, although it's a bad thing. It's a virtuous circle where you have a connection between the speed of fake news uh, being shared, and therefore it being out there more, and being out there more makes it more credible, more believable, and more favorable. In other words, truth, yet again, truth is up against it fighting falsity. To add a little bit more scientific research into this, it's worthwhile bringing into play how the mere exposure effect has allowed fake news to make its mark so fundamentally in the age of social media. Researchers Pennycook, Cannon, and Rand showed in their paper prior exposure increases perceived accuracy of fake news the following findings. They shouldn't have that shouldn't be capitalized. See, I'm doing some editing as we speak. We demonstrate one mechanism that contributes to the believability of fake news: fluency via prior exposure. Using actual fake news headlines presented as they were seen on Facebook, we show that even a single exposure increases subsequent perceptions of accuracy both within the same session and after a week. Moreover, this illusory truth effect for fake news headlines occurs despite a low level of overall believability, and even when the stories are labeled as contested by fact checkers or are inconsistent with the reader's political ideology. These results suggest that social media platforms help to incubate belief in blatantly false news stories, and that tagging such stories as disputed is not an effective solution to this problem. And then I come on to reference this work by Daniel Efron and Medaraj. The title of the paper is Misinformation and Morality: Encountering Fake News Headlines Makes Them Seem Less Unethical to Publish and Share. So people may repeatedly encounter the same misinformation when it, quote, goes viral. The results suggest that repeatedly encountering misinformation makes it seem less unethical to spread, regardless. So there's this truth as illusion effect. So the more you see something, the more credible it becomes, and the more you see something horrific, the less horrific it becomes. So regardless of whether one believes it, seeing a fake news headline 1 or 4 times reduced how unethical participants thought it was to publish and share that headline when they saw it again, even when it was clearly labeled as false and participants disbelieved it, and even after we statistically accounted for judgments of how likable and popular it was. In turn, perceiving the headline as less unethical predicted stronger inclinations to express approval of it online. People were also more likely to actually share repeated headlines than to share new headlines in an experimental setting. We speculate that repeating blatant misinformation may reduce the moral condemnation it receives by making it feel intuitively true, and we discuss other potential mechanisms that might explain this effect. And this is so important in what we're so often talking about here, in how people are sharing information, how we look at propaganda from the Russians and how that gets shared and shared and shared, and horrific things, and the same with what we do, and we should question how we are using social media to share different bits and pieces. I like some of the things that indicate that you haven't read it when you share it. So I think on Facebook now there's this thing where where you receive something and then you say, "Oh, that's really good. I'm going to share that again." Say it's a newspaper article, and you go to share it again. It says, "By the way, you haven't read this. Are you sure you want to share it?" That's just a nice little bit of a reminder to say, you're sharing something that you've seen the headline of, but you haven't seen the content. And is that the right thing to do? Just sharing it, and so there are things that can be put in place. But there's this really interesting, i- interaction, I guess, between all these different components of misinformation, of morally dubious things. That means that we are more likely to find credible things that aren't credible if we see them a lot, and more likely to share them. It's easier to share them, and actually we become desensitized to morally horrible things. I mean, I do it in the context of completely different things in the book I'm writing here, but it's fully applicable to what we're talking about right now. So when you get people like Facebook and Twitter doing somewhat the correct thing to saying this is controversial, actually, it doesn't make much difference to whether people believe it or not. And you have this real issue with falsity being spread, and then you get free speech advocates saying, well, that's fine. You should be able to like work out yourself whether it's true or false. But people don't have the time or the inclination, or even they don't even realize it's false, so they can't even make a choice as to whether they need to check it. It's just that it goes in and it becomes part of their belief system. And so this is why regulation is really important, that you get into really difficult grounds that people don't like getting into, which is like, how do we regulate against this kind of happening and making our society degraded in terms of our information space? And you have to regulate, which is where Twitter and Facebook, as are they publishers, and if they're publishers, are they responsible for what is getting put out there? Okay, maybe not, and all you get arguments over that. And then, well, should they put things in place to highlight where things are false, or even to suppress when they are false? At the moment, Twitter has an algorithm that suppresses people reporting on Ukraine news. And that has been put in place. And I know people hate it when I talk about Musk, but Musk has put in place an algorithm that suppresses people reporting Ukraine news. Thomas Tyner and Jake Bro have had their Twitter accounts shadow banned and placed under 18 plus and sensitive stuff and blah 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 blah. I could talk to you at some depth on this, and this is all part of trying to silence people who are pro-Ukraine rather than pro-Russia. And there is an example of that actually happening, but the wrong way, right? So if you're arguing that Twitter should be all about free speech, it's not about free speech. And in fact, it's about suppressing people who are trying to support Ukraine. Uh, anyway, uh, that aside, I'm of the opinion that this is so. There's a really good article. I'll try and find it. Hang on. Here it is. So it's a BBC article, BBC Future article. So the greatest security threat of the post-truth age. So it's talking about how national security and cybersecurity used to be, big terms that and we're familiar with them, but actually we should become familiar with the term epistemic security. So epistemic security is, I told you, epistemology is to do with truth and knowledge, right? We are in a position now where truth and knowledge are used as weapons, and we are insecure in terms of truth and knowledge. So we need to fight back. Now, fighting back is not, well, people can say anything they like, it's freedom of speech. Because otherwise, you might as well people can shoot weapons wherever they like and kill whoever they like. It's freedom of shooting. You can't have freedom of the ability to use weapons, but not freedom of the ability to harm and damage society by spreading falsehoods. and also using insidious methods to do that, and not just spread them but amplify them. You look at what happened with Radio New Zealand and with Agence France Presse recently, with the stuff getting tampered and pro-Russian narrative replacing just normal reporting. Now, it's freedom of speech, right? Or in one sense, you can say that. In the other sense, you say no. This is actually misinforming people insidiously, and there must be some kind of regulation, some action against that. We can't just, it's no good to say, well, let's just sit back and let humans just deal with it with their own minds, when we know humans are inherently irrational. Look at the work of Kahneman, Daniel Kahneman, in Thinking Fast and Slow and stuff like that. It's like, the whole idea of the free market system working economically is that humans should be able to choose what they want, but actually humans don't have the requisite knowledge to do that. And he showed in his work that humans are irrational. In other words, so in economics, it's called Homo economicus, the idea that all human beings are rational. So therefore, if the free market operated and wasn't regulated at all, we would just choose the right good and buy that, and more demand. Our demand would be, broadly positive and beneficial. It's like, no, we don't have the requisite knowledge, and we're irrational, and we choose the cheapest thing, even if that thing causes the death of animals or humans in a sweatshop to make it. So therefore, you can't just have free market economics run rife. You have to regulate. We can't have 7-year-olds working down in mines. This is what happened in the Industrial Revolution. The free marketeers were arguing, oh no, we want to have kids working down in mines and up chimneys, and the government were like, actually, I'm not sure it's a good idea. We need children, maybe, and then it was like, well, we need to educate them, and so schools were started and so on and so forth. But it's like pure free marketeers will lead, the pure free market in its purest form leads to a complete moral black hole taking place, where you can have slavery, anyone can do anything. Okay, so we need to regulate it at least somewhat, right? It's not talking about going the full whack to communism, but you're like, we need to put some rules in place for health and safety, so that you can't cut your hand off willy-nilly and nothing happens in your job, and you can't send a 4-year-old down into a mine, right? Okay, so let's have some sensible regulation. Okay, the same applies to speech is like, people think it's like free, we should be able to say what we like, and it's like, speaking is just an event. It's a physical event, and it communicates a message in the same way that me punching you in the face is a physical event that communicates a message and causes you harm. Speech can cause harm as well. So actually, if we believe that we can regulate anything, then speech should be regulated as well, because otherwise we get into this situation where, my goodness, it's spreading around, causing harm, and then people at university have to kind of measure that and work out what we do to try and mitigate against you know misinformation, so on and so forth. Anyway, that's me ranting, going off on one. It's a massive area, and I know there are loads of free speech advocates out there. I'm a free speech advocate. I let trolls say broadly almost what they like on my threads. In my previous blogging space, where interestingly we were cancelled by by the right-wing religious organization. I used to blog for Patheos non-religious, right? And there are all these interfaith communities and non. I have no faith, so we were all blogging together, and we had this big conversation with each other, and we all released articles and stuff, and it was all fantastic. And then it got taken over by a new sort of evangelical movement, who then said, "We don't like you guys. You're a bit too political, and we don't like you talking about non-religion. So we're going to shut you down." And they basically shut us down, and we so about 35 of us lost our jobs as writers for our beliefs, right? And okay, there you go. So, if you're talking about cancel culture, does it come from the left? In that instance, I've been twice in my life, I've been cancelled for my non-religious views, but I can't go into the other one because I am under a confidentiality agreement. But nonetheless, when I was there, writing for Patheos Non-Religious, I was harangued by many of my own readers for not banning people who were like overtly racist, for saying all these like horrible things. I wouldn't ban them on my threads, and I had a really lax commenting system, where I would hope that they were hoisted by their own petard. So if you're going to say something disgusting, fair enough, you can say that here. That's fair enough, but you need to be able to justify those opinions. If you can't justify what you're saying, if you keep saying the same thing over and over again, and it's terrible, and I'm challenging you on that on all these points, and you don't answer those challenges, then I won't let you say that, because you're just basically spreading hate without justifying how you can do that. So I let people say what they like. Now, that was okay in that small neck of the internet where I was able to curate that forum really, hopefully, quite positively, but in a intellectually challenging way. But the rest of the world isn't like that, and so there are certain forums where that won't work. And if you have people spreading hate, then actually you might need to do something about that. You can't talk about that here. There are places you can talk about it. Go to Jonathan M.S. Pierce's blog, as was, and talk about it. Oh, you can't now; it's been banned. It's been cancelled. But go over there and talk about it over there. But you can't talk about that here. There's time and a place for everything, and I've talked about this before. You wouldn't want to turn on your television at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, sitting there with your 5-year-old child, and see pornography all over the TV, or like massive violence, people being beheaded. That's freedom of speech. Yeah, fine. There's a time and a place for that, and it ain't here. Okay, so there's just a time and a place for stuff, and it's not anything all the time anywhere, right? We don't accept that in any other context. Okay, so why accept that with speech? I don't stand up in the middle of a wedding ceremony and just start swearing, right? And racially abusing people. Hopefully I get shut down for doing that and taken out of the church or the registry, right? That's the right thing to do. You get shut down for that because that's inappropriate there and then. In the same way that just speech in general, there are time and places. If you want to say horrible things, there are places you can go and say that. But here ain't one of them, or there ain't one of them, and there might be one of them. Okay, so that's my opinion, which is regulate, but there will be places that you can be like that if you want. Just not everywhere. Right, that is my rant over, and yeah, make of that what you will, and I'm sure you will, and a lot of you will have a go at me for that. But take into account what I say, and let's do this respectfully. Okay, Chris Owicki. A church in southwestern Russia has added an unusual element to its Sunday school: lessons in unarmed combat and bayonet practice for children of kindergarten age and upwards. The military-led classes are another manifestation of Russia's militarization of its children. The Siren News Telegram channel reports that the Church of the New Year Martyrs and Confessors in Saratov began hosting military lessons after Sunday worship on 11th of June 2023. Children were taught to march in formation, stab with bayonets, and fight in unarmed combats. That's nice. The training was conducted by the local military sports group Victorious, apparently supervised by a military affiliated individual, perhaps a reservist. The initiative is being promoted by the Saratov Diocese and will continue every Sunday after the Divine Liturgy. Military training for children is becoming increasingly common in Russia. See the thread below, and is considered to be a part of military patriotic curriculum intended to instill patriotic values and a willingness to fight for the motherland. So there's another thread on exactly that, and just the militarization of children in Russia, I think, is pretty horrible. And again, it's an insidious kind of activity pushed on them. Actually, what I did want to go through, though, was his other thread before this, which is with regard to Prigozhin and Wagner. So the Wagner Group is reportedly seeking to increase its political influence in Russia through holding public rallies, ostensibly to promote military patriotic education for young people. It's said to be part of an effort to nightmare competitors. A Russian Telegram channel reports that a source has told it that, quote, the handlers of Prigozhin and PMC Wagner are working to demonstrate the importance of PMC Wagner and the figure of Prigozhin through political marketing in the form of popular support actions. Simply put, the task is to nightmare competitors. Initially, Wagner was created to nightmare everyone abroad, but now Wagner's field of activity is exclusively in Russia. Prigozhin's team has recently markedly increased the number of actions in support of PMC Wagner in the regions. Particular attention is now being paid to the Rostov region. For example, the head of the Rostov-on-Don city administration has already received a notice from the regional representative of PMC Wagner in the Rostov region to hold a series of actions on 24th of June, including an auto rally, allegedly with the aim of attracting volunteers for the war and patriotic education for young people. In reality, they are trying to increase their political influence in the region. It is also noteworthy that in official documents addressed to the city administration, the Wagner representative in the Rostov region signs himself only with the call sign Kotlas. There is no first and last name. So, yeah, this activity, increasing political influence of Prigozhin. I did mention the other day that actually not many people in Moscow doing a vox pop kind of series of interviews with people on the street didn't know who he was. A lot of them, so he's not that well known amongst some of the population in Russia because state TV hasn't been reporting on Wagner because of the argument between them, the tensions between them and the Russian MOD. But it seems that he is positioning himself and Wagner PMC much more in a much more robust manner around the country in a way that I'm sure will set the hackles up of the Russian MOD and the Kremlin. Final thing I'm going to say is thank you so much for being part of this. I really appreciate it. Even if I do say things that you don't agree with, you announced that 19,692 was a next goal for subscribers for ATP Geopolitics that you would celebrate, numbers being arbitrary and all. This is absolutely correct. Like, I don't celebrate like 10,000, 15,000, 20,000. There are any arbitrary numbers. So I did probably say 19,692. Well, Jonathan, you're heading there in quick fashion. Only you can see precise details for your channel metrics. So please do let us know when that magic number ticks up so we may all celebrate with you. And yes, I wrote that number down especially because I knew I would want to reference it at such a time as this. PS, well deserved. Legends of the Universe. For those who know the basis of that title. Thank you for that. I'm sure it is, 19,438. I'm glad that you remembered that. It's really good. I'm probably going to have an Ask Me Anything or some kind of celebratory live stream to celebrate getting to 19,847 because that's the magic number I've always wanted to get to. So come and join me for a live stream then. I'll try and get someone else on to field questions from you good selves concerning geopolitics and the conflict in Ukraine. I can't promise I won't have any rants about philosophy, but fingers crossed it won't happen. Anyway, thanks for all your support. Really appreciate that. Thanks to all the people who gave away memberships the other day in the live stream with Georgie from Ukraine Matters. That's really generous of you. Thanks for all your support. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.